Hi, everybody. It's a long day, and I have no PowerPoint for the last talk of the day. And I have to apologize, because I'm sure you need some visuals. But we're going to go a little old school. And I'll just, be reading some things to you. First, I want to just repeat or endorse Evie's thanks to all of the organizers for having us here, and also for the audience for sticking around. I've been thinking all day about An's comment giving us the matrix, so pretend you see the images of the film, about skinning the cat. So I'm going to, the cat has no skin left, I don't think, but I'll see what else I can extract of it in terms of the auto. And also I wanted to thank Marie for talking about the me, because all morning this morning I was thinking about, because all the papers in the morning section were about the I, and yet the title of the conference is Why Me? And I was thinking about the different grammatical structure and the different affective resonance of the I and the me. You know, that's not what my paper's about, but I appreciated thinking about that. So an earlier version of the talk I'm going to give today was for a conference at Duke organized by Toro Moy. And in Tim's comments this morning, he laid out some of the friction in the auto-fiction conversation. And number one of your different theses had to do with Toro and others who are celebrating, in some sense, autofiction as answering a demand for experiential identification and reality, all right? So some of my aggravation in this piece is about that, and not about the conversation we've had here, which has fabulously not gone there at all. So, anyway, why not me? Auto theories, auto fictions. While the title of an essay is never the whole story, its ambition is always to orient its audience in a certain direction. The direction my title is pointing toward takes us into the neighborhood where auto theory's autobiography is being honed. Auto theory, that memoir that is not one, that self-story that is also part of a philosophy of the self. Why, in the era of auto theory's meteoric rise, does my title turn up the heat with a bit of sarcasm? Why not me? Especially when what is granted to auto theory as an interventionist discourse, no less than a highly marketable commodity, is its utility for historically marginalized subjects, not just to speak, but to claim their speech as their own. Surely we have had enough of alternative facts and fake news, of discourse floating free in the sinews of technological mediation, to authorize a bit, surely we've had enough to authorize a bit of happiness, at least a little relief, that there might still be a future for those old foes, the author and her avatar, the subject, lost now in subjection, not just to language, but to hypermediation and sensorial overload. Shouldn't we be trying to retrieve ourselves from our increasingly fictionalized and conspiratorial world? I know your answer is no. It's my answer too, but I was talking to people whose answer was yes. Anyway. And why be suspicious of the attempt, as I will be in this piece, to carve out of auto theory an autonomous field of inquiry, to spend time enthralled to its canny use of two different kinds of writing, that which takes shape most fully in a revision of the autobiographical, and that which insists in the venue of academic criticism on the personal and intimate as the anchor of critical engagement. My talk pursues these questions by considering auto theory's critical autobiography and some of the fictions that haunt its historical legacy and contemporary emergence. Let me begin then with apologies, not just to auto theory's true believers, though I don't think there are any in this room, but to the conference organizers who invited me to contribute to conversation this weekend in good faith. To be sure, I inadvertently volunteered for the role as curmudgeon, auto theory's curmudgeon, by editing a special issue of an academic journal, Anne talked about it this morning, published in 2020, in which a group of us, some in this room, from graduate students to well-established scholars, set out to engage the burgeoning interest in what has been declared largely by US-based publishers, a new genre of writing. As is often the case with academics, not everyone contributing to the issue was in the mood to agree. Should we really call this writing a new genre? Or actually, should we even call it a genre? Was it true to say that it was new? I mean, the first papers this morning took care of both of those questions. It's not a genre, it's not new. Now let's go have a drink. No. In my introduction, I advocated for breaking the spell of taxonomy by turning from autotheory to the autotheoretical, which could not only claim no single literary or critical form as its own, but might, I naively thought, offer a more historically rich and critically nuanced approach to the contemporary concern of or explosion of concern for literary and critical writing that performs what Stephen Best calls self-study. After all, for decades, we've seen literary critics drive the conversation about the status of autobiography as a genre into a state of total incoherence. How is it different from memoir? How is it different from life writing? And what if Paul Deman is practically right when he says facetiously, any book with a readable title page is, to some extent, autobiographical? In other words, if we couldn't agree about what autobiography is, how could we possibly parse autotheory's resemblance to autobiography or trace the manner and mechanisms of its purported descent? And then there was the messiness of theory to deal with. High or low, early 20th century or late, French or in the tradition of British cultural studies, in the West or everywhere, just white men, or those produced by everyone else, or that produced by everyone else. And where, finally, would we locate the productive force of autotheory? In the pressure theory places on the autobiographical, or the other way around, in what first-person address does to theory? If the special issue had taken the charge that greets us here to assess, in the words of the conference description, the subjective turn in the literary world by engaging the emergence of forms of writing that have been called autofiction, autotheory, critical fabulation, and creative nonfiction, we would have quadrupled our taxonomic burden, as each term runs up against the problem, as Tim talked about this morning, of the problem or the impasse of generic description. Take autofiction. The borders that separate it from autobiography and the bourgeois novel are hard to hold. What then of the definitional relationship between autofiction and its first cousin, autotheory? And some of you may know that in a lot of conversations, the two words get used as though they're interchangeable, but many people see them as a different kind of writing, emphasizing different. I see them as different, but for Ralph Clare, quote, autofiction responds primarily to the postmodern literary scene and the rise of the any-person memoir. This is a quote that An used this morning. While, he says, autotheory responds more to the institutionalization and the so-called death of theory, by which he largely means post-structuralism, or what he calls high or capital T theory, in a gesture that seeks to underscore autotheory as an activist-oriented exploration of what he calls the living identities of marginalized subjectivities. And it's this aspect of the conversation about autotheory that will most interest me, which has resonance, Evie, with what you're talking about the double bind for Black women in your talk, but here for marginalized subjects, the double bind of the recruitment into the I, but the staging of the I is already a social form that is the site of a certain kind of oppression, right? So in Clare's terms, both genres, which he reads as genres, are committed to honesty and lived experience, but autotheory's sincerity, he writes, lies in the exposure to a vulnerable self that recognizes its contingency and social linguistic constructedness. So it's more theoretical than the autofictional one. And I was really struck this morning in Gabriella's talk that there was the language of sincerity, where she kind of deconstructed the language of sincerity, right? A sincere narrator, she said, lies to himself. A fictional narrator lies to us, right? So the sincerity itself can never be quote unquote honest, right? For Hywell Dix, the editor of the 2018 collection, Autofiction in English, the constructedness at stake in Clare's definition of autotheory is actually owned by autofictional practices, as the truths that autofiction tells often exist in the order of symbolic meaning rather than as the revelation of empirical fact. For Jagoda Taliska, autofiction is itself, quote, a theoretical concept, a construction of perception, which calls for the dissolution of the genre of autobiography as we know it, but from the side of the literary or of fiction, not from the side of academic criticism. And here it means, by which they mean the destruction of the fiction of the story of a singular and exceptional life imploded narratively. And for Teresa Carmody, writing in the Los Angeles Review of Books, the distinction between autotheory and autofiction entails a divergence between experience and truth. Autotheory, she says, declares this is true, while autofiction suggests this may be true. Right, that's the one kind of writing then, autotheory, is laden with epistemological force, while the other, autofiction, works the fault lines between the complexity of lived reality, literary aesthetics, and the so-called facts. As this sampling makes clear, and what's interesting in all the papers that are trying to work on these same topics, we have different archives, and that's where the question of context becomes super important, right? But as this sampling, so the archive I constructed that allows me to have the conversation I want here makes clear, when it comes to what autotheory and autofiction share, the best place to start, which appears to lead quite quickly to the finish, is to say that there is no critical consensus regarding the meaning of either term. Still, they often share an origin story, which rather undercuts attempts at highbrow distinctions, as each designation took hold as a marketing description, appearing on the book covers of work by Serge Dabrowski and Maggie Nelson to name and claim their author's transgression of seemingly established genre conventions. Today, of course, no matter how often critics reiterate the failure of agreed upon definitions, as I have just done, conversations about autofiction and autotheory often proceed as if the transgressions they name are recognizable in a set of conventions of their own. I mean, happily, that's not the conversation we've been having here. We're not repeating that. So I feel like the conversation is really moving forward here, which is great. But in the context of when these when it's thought that this is these are transgressive genres and recognizable, one can only say that little usually interrupts academic convention that claims as radical new the transgression of convention, including those conventions that aim to determine which transgressions belong to which term and how far we can ever go in calling any feature of life or art radical or new. So that's the academic commodification part of it. Have you ever found yourself dead-ending into a cul-de-sac where the houses did not look the same? I have not. Thank you for getting that. I appreciate that. And I didn't even tell you to laugh. All of this is to say that the task of illuminating the relationship between me writing falters on the famed difficulty of comparison, which requires the pretense, at the very least, that the entities under discussion are in themselves discrete. And we all know that the problem of comparison ramifies well beyond this instance that I'm talking about here. Anna and I live in a department called literature because it doesn't believe in comparison, which is why nobody knows what we do, right? Because there's an English department there as well, because we dropped the comparison because of the fantasy of it. Anyway, this problem, though, makes trying to track down the distinctions in these terms from conventional autobiography, from literary fiction, from critical theory, from academic prose, from one another, a mind-reading foray into the critic's desire to forge an allegiance to some interpretive vision of the energies that have and continue to keep the deeply modern language of the self in critical and creative motion. Thus, when the conference description asks if we can, quote, speak of a shared emancipatory project in expressive practices of first-person writing, or are such projects better understood as plural and multiple, unquote, we can have it both ways, right? There is a shared emancipatory project precisely because first-person writing as a form of cultural expression is plural and multiple, just like people are. And I'm thinking of Sedgwick's axiom number 1, right there. But when it comes to the next question in the conference description, quote, are some forms of personalized access to literary expression emancipatory and egalitarian, and others anti-democratic and or ideological? And if so, what principles determine this? Here we're driven toward a much different but no less confounding distinction, one that begs a few questions of its own. Is the emancipatory not itself ideological? They're put on two different sides in the question, right? Will the principles on which our critical judgments are made be free of ideology if we claim egalitarianism and democracy on our side? Isn't the very idea of democracy itself ideological? So in other words, I don't think there are principles that we can find that are going to determine this question. Nonetheless, nitpicking aside, what we can hear in the need to distinguish emancipatory from anti-democratic expression is a suspicion and a desire. And it's a suspicion and a desire that I'm going to tag to the conference, right? A suspicion that beyond the literary critical warfare over definition, what empowers auto-theory and auto-fiction, no less than critical fabulation and creative nonfiction, is their potentially, quite neat fit with forces of political complicity and corruption. You only need to think here about commodification, the commodification of the personal, of the intimate, or if you want to use the language of neoliberalism, the entrepreneurial subject for whom the self is the source and the foundation of human capital, right? So that's the suspicion that's raised, I think, that underlies the question of fiction, the age of fictionalized facts. But also there's a desire, right? A desire that this not be the case, right? Or should I say a desire that we can make the case for emancipating first-person expression from these charges. A subsequent question in the conference description brings my point home, I think. Quote, when do expressions of subjectivity serve as modes of resistance to the co-optation, colonization, or commodification of subject positions, and when as vehicles of it? Here, what I have called suspicion is manifested fully as a fact, not do expressions of subjectivity serve as modes of resistance, but when do they, right? Which produces the promise, or the potential promise of arriving at an affirmative answer to the question being posed. To dissent from this promise, as I plan to, is not to dismiss or belittle the wish that propels it, but it is to open the space of the auto that drives every act of criticism, whether produced in the language of I or not. What follows then is some stake-making of my own. My concern, as my subtitle indicates, is to trace the critical fictions being spun in the conversations that are now moving auto theory from a marketing designation to an academic object of study, especially as these conversations often collectively agree, if at times subtly, that what the auto brings to theory is an embodied interruption of theory's abstraction and false claims to objectivity. Ralph Clare is not alone in naming the agency marginalized subjectivities, which points to the way that auto theory is being critically written as the designation of what Max Kavich more recently calls, quote, movement-allied styles of thinking, such as critical race theory and queer theory. Movement writing then that offers, quote, expressive and conceptual space for the rearticulation of intersectional identities. And there what's interesting is the idea that there are some identities that are intersectional, and there are some that are not. Like it restages that problem that feminist theory has been critiquing for a while now. It is this investment, though, in auto theory as an intrinsically political mode of embodied writing and speech that most interests me, as it comes freighted with some pretty heavy political and critical baggage of its own, including what it means to valorize the personal and embodied for social subjects who have had to contest their reduction to the body, to the personal, and to a subjectivity shorn of the capacity to claim subjecthood, no matter how much. So, the baggage is the valorization, trying to valorize that which has been the very mode and means, right, of oppression, no matter how much the spectacle of their difference, racial, sexual, gendered, are always the first and mostly the last, which is to say, quite often the only thing to be known about them and to be known as stereotype, as false facts anyway. So to get at these matters, let me work through some details of the neighborhood auto theory lives in by seeing where one definition leads. The conference that I made reference to last year put it this way. In the United States, it wrote, auto theory has become the term for a kind of writing that blends memoir and autobiography with fiction and critical theory, understood as the legacy of post-structuralist thought. This seems maybe a little right to me, though it is rare for auto theory to be defined or studied as fiction, so the word fiction there not, but definitely the relation to post-structuralist theory is there. I mean, Maggie Nelson's book is one of the, texts of auto theory, and those of you who haven't read it won't, the margins have the names of the theorists, sometimes artists, but often theorists that go with, that match quotes that she uses in the text. And so she's creating a conversation between the personal writing about her own experience of being pregnant and giving birth, and about her partner's transformation, and as well as what other people have written in queer theory. And I think Sedgwick, if I remember correctly, actually is the most cited theorist in that text. But everybody, Lee Edelman, Jane Gallup, lots of people appear, Butler too. So I want to begin to suggest that there's a manifesto-like inscription of auto theory as transgression, right? That I want us to think about how it might risk mistaking the critic's political commitment, right, to finding transgression in the object as the object's own. So one of the things that I'm doing that other people haven't done is that people have been looking at texts very carefully, right, and looking at the way that they dissolve and rethink their use of the I. I'm interested in how some of the criticism about auto theory shores up some of that decomposition by celebrating it only as as a kind of transgression, as though it's not itself as complicated as the text would would tell us. Anyway. This is not to say that the texts that travel under the moniker of auto theory have no political investment. On the contrary, the growing list of regularly cited texts are valued precisely on these grounds. Let's think here of, these are familiar, Matt Nelson's The Argonauts, as I said, Sarah Ahmed's Living a Feminist Life, Frank Wilderson's Afro-Pessimism, all are representative of their repetition as auto-theoretical texts. But what concerns me is how the identity of the author as marginal vis-a-vis a violently hierarchical social structure and violently hierarchical publishing industry becomes the classificatory condition under which auto theory as a mode of interventionist writing is being forged. Consider how elaborating our list would reinforce this point. There's Paul Preciado's Testo Junkie, which is often credited with coining the term auto theory before Maggie Nelson packaged it and it appeared on her book. Or Claudia Rankine's Citizen, an American lyric, Christina Sharp's In the Wake on Blackness and Being, Saidiya Hartman's Lose Your Mother, Christina Crosby's A Body Undone, Lauren Berlant and Kathleen Stewart's The Hundreds, and Eve Sedgwick's A Dialogue on Love. While this collection includes a multiracial cast of queers, it should be noted that everyone here has had or continues to have employment in universities, either as writers or scholars or both. And I'll just say to the side, in a longer version of this talk, or in more thinking, I'm interested in unraveling what lies behind my suspicion that auto theory in its academic enunciation as criticism offers the humanities the promise of an antidote to a long list of our institutional miseries, which get worse by the day, right? Including the misery of being witness to the humanities and the university as we know it coming to an end. But in the kinship of the books that I have listed above, you would also find Chris Kraus's I Love Dick, because it's regularly included, given its depiction of the gendered politics of academia during the early years of the transatlantic migration of French theory. But unlike the others listed, it is also regularly cited as the urtext of American autofiction, largely because it shares three frequently cited characteristics of the form. What I have called the conventions wrought from transgression. I Love Dick. It registers its literariness in dialogue with the novel, which a lot of auto theory does not necessarily. Some of it can be poetry. 2, its protagonist and artist and writer bears the name of the author. And 3, its narrative is purportedly drawn from real life. Or, as Kraus rather cheekily puts it, I like to, quote, I like to say that everything that happens in the book happened in real life, but it is not a memoir, unquote. Kraus, for those who might not know this, founded Semiotext with her then husband, one of Roland Barthes' students who was convinced that women didn't write theory. Hence the launch in 1990 of the Native Agent series that Kraus continues to edit, to explore, as the homepage puts it, American voices and issues of subjectivity with an emphasis on women and queer experience. Like I Love Dick, many of the texts in the series shuttle between the auto-fictional and the auto-theoretical by raising questions about, some would argue by closing the gap between art and life, philosophy and imagination, critical reflection, and everyday experience. For Kraus, who admits in her own manifesto-like statements about personal writing to have a deep attraction to the use of the first person, these texts are not so much explorations of the singular person or reconstellations of the liberal individual, but explorations of what she calls the expanded I, whose theoretical punchline, she writes, was delivered by Deleuze decades ago. Life, he insisted, is not personal. And yet for Kraus, as for many of the theorists or thinkers of auto theory, both living and writing begin here, with the personal as vantage point and engine of both literary and critical style. And none of that am I critical of. I mean, I'm just describing. Semiotext is not the only press that lives in auto theory's neighborhood. Down the block from it, in a somewhat newer extension, is Grey Wolf, which published both Nelson and Rankin and has a number of titles coming out regularly in this genre. And around the corner is the academic press that is becoming, if recent descriptions are any indication, most affiliated with auto theory, at my own university, Duke University Press. Its recently launched series, Writing Matters, co-founded by Lauren Berlant and now edited by Sadia Hartman, Erica Rand, Monica Huerta, and Kathleen Stewart, seeks, quote, to expand the tone, reach, claims, and attitudes of conceptual critical writing. It is grounded in queer, women of color, auto theory, feminist and ficto-critical tradition, and poetics that lead with voice, texture, density, rhythm, and atmosphere. But Duke University Press did not publish the only monograph to date on auto theory. That copyright belongs to MIT, which gave us Lauren Fournier's book, and she'll be speaking tomorrow, first researched as a dissertation on auto theory as feminist practice in art, writing, and criticism. For Fournier, auto theory has the potential, quote, to become the next big turn in visual and literary studies, even as it claims, even as she's very interested in the resonant past for the category, given that, in her words, the history of feminism is, in a sense, a history of auto theory. As Fournier and many who have reviewed the book have discussed, the feminist mantra, the personal as political is not so much a prescient inscription of Autotheory's convictions, but a keynote of its invention, given that the practice of theorizing from the first person is well established, Fournier writes, within feminist genealogies. Especially, she notes, those that center on, in the 1970s, on feminist writings of women of color. For Ralph Clare, who seconds this position, autotheoretical styles the political as personal. So he flips it, right, in his description. It's the political as personal, which shifts the famous phrase while conferring on autotheoretical authors the political value of their auto-inflections. Theorizing from the first person. This phrase is central to one of Autotheory's various self-constituting fictions, I would call it, which is not a negative. I love fictions. Right? All relations to objects of our study are forms of desire and practices of desiring, by which I mean the stories that are told about the history and specification of it as a genre, or in the claim of making it as a genre, that largely position first personal speech as the unimpeachable epistemological ground of autotheory's political intervention. For some critics, autotheory is a way of constituting a kind of wholeness, like an integration between theory and experience, between life and art, etc., between philosophy and self-knowing, which is underscored by Ralph Clare's insistence that autotheory challenges the authority of the so-called master discourses of theory by emphasizing embodied experience or lived reality. I say so-called here, so-called master discourses, because in feminist and gender studies, experience and embodiment also travel as privileged canonical terms, whose hold over the field is routinely cast as an interruption of organizations of power and knowledge that subtend the universalizing pretensions of enlightened liberalism. So yes, I am saying that interventions, even those that come from the margins, become canonical and mastering when their truth regime can't be questioned, or when, as in the case of experience and embodiment, their questioning becomes more a citational ritual than a critical intervention. Joan Scott may have forced attention to the constructedness of the category of experience, that is, to the way that experience is a concept, not a transparency, in her now famous essay of 1991. But in some of the discourses around autotheory that bear an insistence on it having a politicized origin, the embodied experience is positioned reparatively as the necessary counter for historically marginalized groups to strip, in one critic's terms, the pretense of objectivity away from the theorizing voice. And this critic talks about autotheory as allowing its user to metabolize concepts directly out of one's lived experience rather than internalizing exteriorly developed concepts or constructs, which may in fact be damaging to one's sense of self. The critical framework assumed here delivers us into a confounding dilemma. I don't think you have to be, as I am, a still fallen post-structuralist to wonder over the prospect of having an internal world able to generate of its own accord a sense of self uncontaminated by what is not me, or to question the insistence that when I write about my experience, the text can be taken as my embodied experience. These conflations of first-person speech as embodiment and of theory as disembodied voice persists even though feminist theory teaches us in what we could call, if we were so willing, it's an auto-theoretical mode of reading as opposed to writing, that it would teach us that the objective voice used in theory has a body. It has insisted it for years, the white Western masculine, founded on a fantasy of its very disembodiment. As a consequence of not always believing what we preach and teach, the racialized gender structure of authority in these conversations is paradoxically shored up in the pretense of taking it down, as we reiterate the idea that minoritized voice and being lives in the body, in the sphere of the personal and intimate, and that it is precisely this living that autotheory embodies in textual or artistic form. On this score, let me just say, since you're trapped in your seats, that one of the things that confuses me the most about the propulsion to surface and other modes of reading, shout out Elizabeth Weed, is the assumption that resides within them, that the critical projects nurtured and promoted by the hermeneutics of suspicion were so thorough that little else was allowed to exist in the years of its hegemony. It is my sense that no matter what we now say about the last 40 or 50 years and its commitments to theory, to critique, to constructionism, to language, to the text, there was no death of the author, no abandonment of the self, no deauthorization of essentialism, no retreat from trying to understand everyday life, no forfeiture of description for abstraction, no resolute privileging of objectivity over subjectivity. Sure, people proposed as much, but since the entire edifice of theory, capital T, if you want to call it that, was conditioned on the belief that to undermine humanism, we needed to stop reading language innocently, it makes no sense to me now to read the recent critical past by reducing it to literalizing frameworks. That's okay. And actually, I, or we, don't have to. Even when the proliferating discourse of autotheory is keen to give it a reputation of collective counter-hegemonic transgression, as if there are no traditions in reading race or gender or sexuality that would resist the implication that the value of autotheory is what the autotheory does to and as theory alone. Many of you may hear the reverberations of Ray Chow's The Protestant Ethnic here in my underwriting insistence that self-expressivity does not begin its social sojourn as a mode of writing or performance on a neutral terrain. Chow takes the figure of I confess, therefore I am, as shorthand for intervening in the contemporary turn to the self in global culture by explicating precisely the conundrum of the minoritized subject, alternately designated in this book as ethnic, third world, and non-Western, for whom confession always carries with it the implication of the crime. She writes, the crime that has been declared on them socially long before they speak. For Chow, the seeming truth function conferred on what we can call more broadly, as Kavich does, the non-hegemonic subject, cuts both ways, offering the seeming liberation of first-person expression because it has been denied, while also designating the auto as a difference always collectively, which is to say monolithically or stereotypically shared, which is what Evie was talking about. Chow calls this critical alignment a form of national allegory and reads the non-hegemonic subject's consent to the demand for the demand of first-person speech as a form of biopolitical management that does its work by offering up the minoritized ethnic or sexual self as a self-consuming pleasure. Here she says in Open Rebellion, quote, the thing to imitate, resemble, and become is none other than the ethnic or sexual minority herself. Chow is not the only critic working in what we might call critical race theory, not in its specific legal genealogies, but in its cultural studies and critical theory ones. But she's not the only one whose work shapes my rebuttal to the prospect that autotheory's transgression lies in its ability to record and emancipate the minoritized. In Dead Subjects Towards a Politics of Loss in Latino Studies, Antonio Viego makes clear that the ego-psychological subject that undergirds projects of minoritized self-representation bears a cost of its own, which has to do with developing and adapting to modes of therapeutic self-management that cover over, as he puts it, the ways in which repeated themes of wholeness, completeness, and self-transparency are what provide racist discourse with precisely the notion of subjectivity that it needs in order to function most effectively, unquote. And Julian Fisher, whose dissertation was recently completed at Duke, follows this kind of psychoanalytic direction by considering the complexity of first-person speech and self-knowing that trans subjects must project and perform in order to become legible to medical and state actors as suffering subjects entitled to documents and procedures offered, when they are offered at all, as modes of care and repair. His project wants to inhabit the ambivalence and to insist on it, right, that comes from being both inside the auto performance while resisting the charge to take it as expressively true or real. In his terms, the binary between symbolic meaning and empirical fact, between this may be true and this is true, rests too securely on the idea that the auto is an agent that is somehow knowable and unitary, not caught up then in the social form within which it speaks. Other work comes to mind to me here as well. Wilderson's refusal in Afro-pessimism to concede to minoritization as a form of equivalent antagonisms, like as though racialization is the same for all supposedly racially minoritized subjects. Or Patrice Douglas's insistence on Black gender, both of which interrupt the manifesting enthusiasm for autotheory to be a mode of writing that collectivizes non-hegemonic or intersectional subjectivities. I also think we have much to learn from Kevin Quashie's The Sovereignty of Quiet, which offers a hesitation about the impossibility of Black life to be personal and private, given the depersonalization that the spectacle of Black death and Black suffering routinely publicly performs. My point here is that the emerging critical discourse about autotheory, written when it is as transgression in the name of minoritization and marginalization, needs more of the theory it otherwise sets itself against in order to tend to the complexity of its deeply socialized and commodified conventions. But to be clear, the autocorrection I am calling for is not a return to the death of the author, but an insistence that no matter the exhaustion with theory's seemingly dematerialization of embodied being, that being is not transparently available in language, which is to say, it doesn't live in the text or in its writing, no matter how productively and performatively it is sought there. So, why not me? Because there is always more going on when the author occupies the I than the seeming reiteration of the auto's authenticity. It's that not, and the impossibilities it reflects of the self's self-translation that compels me to keep talking about autotheory, even when, unlike today, I'm not being paid for it. Thank you.